I'm basically going to talk about the God of the gaps argument. I will explain exactly what it is in the next slide. And I will argue that while that argument is often criticized as human knowledge has expanded, there's a more nuanced version of the argument that actually is more logical and is actually logically defensible, more logically defensible than the alternative. And Which is to say that science will eventually discover all truths that could possibly be true. And I'm going to use something called Gödel's incompleteness theorem. If you don't know what that is, totally fine. I will explain it in very simple layman's terms. And I'll explain how it points out a flaw in systems of logic, a fundamental flaw, one that I thought was trivial at first, but as I learned more about it and tried to describe it, and I think I can now describe it much better than I could in the early days. It's basically a flaw to rational argument. And those of you who have seen me in the past and know me well know I'm very big on rational arguments. And so here I'm sort of arguing against my primary mantra, which is to try to think about things logically and consistently. But I'm going to try to point out the limitations of logical and consistent beliefs, and try to talk about what the alternative is. It's not the two choices that were given, which is 100% science or 100% religion. I think there's a middle road, like I mentioned earlier. Um, I'll talk about what well, I'll just leave it at that. And let me go to the next. Let me explain what the God of the gaps argument is. So it's basically when if you don't understand something, the God of the gaps says, you know, that is explained by God, right? So if we say, well, what caused the singularity at the beginning of the Big Bang? Well, we don't understand. So, well, God caused the singularity at the Big Bang. That would be a God of the gaps argument because scientists haven't really come up with a good explanation
A lot of
for
it is
how
probably
that singularity.
arthritis. It's not. It's a lot of it is probably arthritis.
So Daniel, you weren't on mute, so I just muted you. We don't mute people by default. We probably should change that setting. But I appreciate everyone muting. Um, so, but basically, scientists, don't have a good explanation for how did that first singularity come to be. Now, I have an alternative hypothesis that does give an explanation for that. If that topic interests you, go to the YouTube channel on the origins of the universe, and I think there's a better explanation than scientists can give today about the origins of that singularity. But that's another story from another night. Tonight's topic, I'm going to be talking about how God essentially fills that gap in knowledge by saying, I don't understand, therefore God did it, or God is the cause of it, God is the explanation. And you can basically use God as a catch-all for every argument of something you don't understand. Now, most people in philosophical circles poke fun at this argument because it's not a very science-based approach, and people often answer God to questions that science has really good answers to. And as you'll find out tonight, that's not what I'm arguing. I do think, though, that while in many cases the God of the gaps argument is an unwise thing to do, I'm going to make an argument that there are some places where the God of the gaps argument is okay. And it doesn't have to be God that fills the gaps, by the way. It can be whatever philosophical system, belief system, any system that you want can be what fills the gaps. And so that's why, to Carl's point, like I'm not necessarily defining God, because when I say God of the gaps, I just mean an explanation other than science explaining something. You can call that explanation or that source of that explanation anything you want. Most people call it God, but you can come up with whatever explanation you want, the spaghetti monster or whatever. Um, so essentially, let me go into what Gödel's incompleteness theorem is. By the way, Gödel had two incompleteness theorems, which is very confusing. But I'm talking about the first of his two incompleteness theorems. And basically, what it says is that if you have a system of logic, which is assumptions and rules of inference, and that system of logic has to be strong enough to handle basic arithmetic, that it will always run into truths that it cannot prove. And basically, you can more or less say it's any system of logic that's meaningful can handle basic arithmetic. Um, Basically, science itself is a system of logic that can handle basic arithmetic. And so no matter how tightly you build the rules in that system, there are always going to be things that are true, excuse me, things that are true that are forever out of reach of being proved by that logically consistent set of rules. And that is baffling. I don't expect you to believe it on rote faith because when I first learned about Gödel's incompleteness theorem, I thought Gödel was wrong. I went about trying to prove Gödel wrong, and well, Gödel won. And that's what led to my essay defending that we have free will, which I use Gödel's incompleteness theorem to do, which is another story from another day. If you want to hear that argument, you can find that on YouTube as well. So basically, the idea is no matter how strong your logic is and no matter how complete your logical system is, there are always things it can't explain. And I'm going to try to prove this to you with a logical example in the next slide. So let's suppose that we have a universal truth machine. I'm going to call the universal truth machine the laws of physics and say that science says the universe is finite. I say it's infinite. And not all science. Some says that it's infinite, but most scientists say that it's finite. But whether you think it's finite or infinite doesn't matter. What matters is if you take all truths in the universe and you look at the laws of physics are what most scientists will say are the only things that determine the next moment in time. Well, you can actually create a logical system out of the universe at a moment in time, and then the universe at the next moment in time, which is acting on the laws of physics. And it creates this function of sorts, which basically says, whatever the situation of the universe right now, the next infinitesimally small moment of time, which is called the Planck length of time, which is the smallest possible unit of time that's measurable that we know of. Um, it's supposed to be the smallest theoretically possible. But basically, to get from this moment in time to the next infinitesimally small moment of time, there's got to be a logical system, right? The laws of physics is what we understand. Not our understanding of the laws of physics, mind you, the actual laws of physics themselves that operate on the universe. So now, if you were to say, okay, well, let's say that those laws of physics, can prove true everything that is true. Well, then let's ask the laws of physics a question. And Gödel has a special question, which says the universal truth machine, which is our laws of physics, will never say that this statement is true. So there's two choices. Either the machine says that the statement is true, which means that it's contradicting itself because it said it would never say that the statement was true, or the machine says the statement is false. And then the statement was actually right because the machine never printed it as true. So you're really only given, and I'm going to write this in the chat because it's a little hard to just fathom and explain. It's very deep, um, but hopefully you can understand in looking at it um, that it's actually logically impossible for a machine that can always tell the truth. And if we think of perfect knowledge of the laws of physics, not our knowledge, but suppose that humanity doesn't destroy itself, which I hope it doesn't, but suppose that we don't, and a couple billion years from now, we probably will have perfect understanding of the laws of physics. Well, actually, what this system says is that if you ask it this question, that perfect understanding of the laws of physics will not be able to answer 100% of questions true. And if you notice something about the question that I asked it, it was a self-referential question. It was a question responding to itself. And so basically, what you come to is the understanding that because a universal truth machine, quote unquote, can't possibly answer that question true because if it answers it true, it's wrong. And if it answers it false, it's wrong. It's always going to be wrong when answering that question. There are certain truths about the universe that a consistent set of rules, will be unable to answer, which means that there is no universal truth machine. It's impossible to have a universal truth machine. And that's what I use to defend that we don't have free will, or that we do have free will, because um, if the laws of physics themselves are not the sole determinant of the future, and there are certain questions that the laws of physics can't answer, then basically there has to be something other than the laws of physics at work in what determines the future. And Jacques, keep your hand up, but we're going to take questions at the end. Like by popular demand, people want to do questions at the end of the presentation. But I will tell you, we don't have a lot more slides, so it'll be quick. So essentially, that even the most powerful truth-telling machine will always have blind spots. That's what it comes down to. Now, let's talk about whether or not science is a logically consistent set of rules. Science creates repeatable experiments that try to create logically consistent sets of rules about how we believe the universe works. So our scientific knowledge keeps expanding, and as it does, Gödel's incompleteness theorem shows us that at some point, there is an end boundary of what scientific knowledge can teach us as a consistent set of rules. Now, eventually, knowledge gained from our consistent set of rules is just going to be unable to prove something true that is actually true. And so people have asked me for a tangible example of what is meant by a self-referential statement. I would argue we as human beings have some essence of our free will. And tonight is not about free will, so let's not go off on a tangent of that until after we've discovered the God of the gaps argument. But if we cover the God of the gaps argument, I'm happy to take questions about free will. I love to talk about that. But when I say a self-defining truth, what I mean is that we as a human being can define for ourselves. For example, I like to give the example of what's my favorite ice cream flavor. And, I go back and forth between fish food, Ben and Jerry's fish food, and Ben and Jerry's mint cookies and cream. These are both delicious flavors. If Ben and Jerry's still had its original s'mores, I would say that was my favorite. But right now, I'm back and forth between these two, and no scientific experiment or proof could figure out which one is my favorite because I don't even know until I feel like deciding to eat ice cream, and then I decide. So it's a self-defining statement that no scientific, system could prove true with 100% certainty. Um, so I talked about that. So what does this mean? So when science doesn't have an answer, and this is basically the slide for my core argument tonight, when science has a really highly probabilistic answer for something, trust science. Like science is really good at proving stuff true. That's why we have microwaves and fridges and all this, heat and running water. All these things have been brought to us by science, and although the Romans had running water. So, but computers and technology all brought to us by science, right? So when science has a really good answer to something with a very high probability of being true, trust that it's true. And look at the science around that subject, look at the data, look at it objectively, look if there's a good answer that we as humanity could know. And if it has a good answer, trust that answer is true. If you can find flaws in it, which a lot of the arguments that I make in the FTI, I find flaws with existing, paradigms, including tonight, right? I'm arguing that there's a place for the God of the gaps. What's that place is the place is if science doesn't have a really good answer for something, trust whatever you want because you know what? There's no good, consistent answer. You should do what in your gut feels right. And what I would argue is that the gut actually has this ability to tap into uh, the essence of who we are and our spirituality. And I would argue that if my argument defending free will is right, we actually do have a spirit or metaphysical essence of ourselves. And and so if that's true, and whether that's true or not, I can tell you if you think about the times that you did and did not trust your gut, if your experience is anything like me, I regretted the times I didn't trust my gut, even when I could logically defend the alternative. I pretty much always should have tried to follow my gut. And so if I have a good, and those were not cases where there was a good scientific answer for one versus the other. So all I'm saying is if there's a great scientific answer for something, probably best to trust it. If there's not, you're welcome to come up with whatever paradigm you want to answer that question. And if you want to say, well, God is the reason, okay, cool. But if 3 years from now science comes up with a good answer, probably best to trust science at that point. Um, you know, Ultimately, I think trusting your gut is super important, but you also want to realize that confirmation bias is very strong in most people, and confirmation bias means that we want to believe that we're right about stuff. And so you may confuse what is a gut instinct versus what you want to believe is right about things. and it's important to keep an open mind. That's part of the second intention of the FTI. I mentioned the first intention in my intro. The second intention is to share your beliefs with other people transparently and authentically, and then to listen with an open mind to what other people say, if it'll help be a better version of yourself, to be more polite, to be closer to truth, or to be more fair. And so all I would say is, you know, yeah, well, I've hammered that home. So the one thing I would say is there's a hubris of science because science has brought so much to the world, and it's been the biggest contributor to safety, health, wealth that humanity has ever known. Like we live in an amazing world, and it's many parts because of science. I will make arguments that we have invested too much in science and not enough in the social sciences, which teach wisdom. And I think we have so much knowledge with so little wisdom in society that we're in a bad spot because we don't necessarily know who's capable of wielding how much power, and we don't always put the right people in positions of power. I would argue we very often get it wrong. But tonight's not about politics. I have that criticism in general. But basically, all I would say is that the specific place that it's the most important to remember that you want to keep an open mind, that science may not have an answer, is for self-defining problems. And so that's where trusting your gut is probably going to be a better decision than trying to find an answer in science. For things that are your preferences and your beliefs, you know, sure, like science might give you advice, but you really ultimately have to be the decision maker of, your choices in life. So that said, I'm gonna go to the questions, and I have to give a quick spiel on our Q&A portion. And so what was that? 20 minutes. Look, we have an hour and 40 minutes for questions if I can stay up that long. So we limit questions and comments to one question or comment at a time per time that you raise your hand, and then limit that to less than 2 or 3 minutes, please, so that everyone can get a chance to ask questions, unless there are no hands up, and then have at it. And then if you want to respond to something that someone just said, whether it's the person with their hand up, me, or some third party, just jump in. Like, feel free to jump in. We can actually have a fluid conversation with a 40-person group, believe it or not. We do this all the time, and we do it. 41 people now. And then when you jump in, keep it to less than 20 seconds. That's what keeps the conversation flowing. So when you have a hand up, 2 or 3 minutes. If you're jumping in, less than 20 seconds. And with that, we'll have a great conversation, and looking forward to the Q&A. Jacques, bonsoir.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify something. You postulated a truth-telling machine, and
Right.
then you asked the truth-telling machine a question. What was the question that you asked the truth-telling machine?
So I put that in the chat. Let me, because it's a little tricky. The question is, the universal truth machine will never say this statement is true.
That's not a question.
Right. That's a
Well,
statement.
you can turn a statement into a question, but it's a statement. So if it's a universal truth machine, it should be able to answer it should be able to answer any question. And so, or like it. Let's see. Can I think I don't want to on the fly turn it into a question because I might get it wrong because it's been a long day. But essentially, the universal truth machine needs to be able to assert whether or not something is true or false. So the question is this question is the here's the question. Is this statement true or false? The universal truth machine will never print this statement is true. That's the question.
Oh, okay, but I mean that's clearly a paradox. There is no right answer to that question.
Well, you you would say that because you can't find a logical right answer to it. But, ultimately the universe has to decide what's going to happen at the next moment in time. So it has to come up with an answer. So a universal truth machine has to be able to answer all questions true. So you can say
But
that it's a
it,
paradox, but a paradox is just an explanation for something we don't have an explanation to so far. What this is it's actually a question that is completely unanswerable by a system that can consistently answer every single question true. Um,
But
th-
it, but it, but that statement or that question doesn't have a right answer because it's paradoxical. There is no right answer to that question.
Um,
There can't be a right answer to that question because it sort of just by the way it's framed.
That's the point.
yeah, that's why
Yeah,
it points out a
yeah.
logical
But what is that? What
contradiction
does
in
that
logical
really
system.
tell you then? I mean, if you're feeding a truth machine a question that can't be determined whether it's true or false by the very structure of the statement or the question, what are you really proving?
You're proving that there is no universal truth machine that can answer all questions accurately.
And if that's the case, what does that even mean? I mean, so you don't have a truth machine that can answer questions.
That means that
Yeah.
given the translation that or the what I did is I equated that truth machine to the laws of physics, right? And so the reason that it's relevant is that if you were to take the universal truth machine being the laws of physics, the laws of physics themselves can't answer true every question answerable in the universe, meaning the mass energy position of every infinitesimally small point of mass and energy at the next moment in the Planck length of time. So essentially, what it says is that there's more to the universe than the laws of physics.
Now that's the Heisenberg principle, right? I mean,
No, the Heisenberg
uh,
principle doesn't have an explanation. I'm explaining why the Heisenberg principle is true. The Heisenberg principle was found through observations, and they
uh-huh,
found that they couldn't find a way that velocity and location could both be simultaneously found, but they didn't
uh-huh.
know why. What I can explain is why.
And you can explain that because there are true statements that can't be proven. Is that
Correct. And by translating the laws of physics to the universal truth machine, which is the clever part of my argument defending free will. Now we're getting onto free will, and it's probably inevitable that we do, um, but yes, that's right.
okay?
Thank you. Good question, Jacques. Good questions.
It kind of
Carl.
reminds me, yeah, I always thought that a paradox was something that was self-contradictory, meaning it's neither true or false, so you can never find the answer.
No, it's just things that we don't currently know. Because, for example, I like to come up with answers to paradoxes. So, for example, there's a paradox that says you can't time travel because you can't shoot your own grandfather, right? What if you
Right,
travel back in time, you shot your own
right,
grandfather? How would you exist? And so that's
right,
considered a paradox, but it's actually not a paradox because if you think about it from the terms of the multiverse. And if you go back in a parallel multiverse, you shoot your
okay,
grandfather in that multiverse, you
yeah,
were never
right,
born in that multiverse, but you traveled the
yeah,
multiverse to get there. So actually it's
yeah,
not a paradox. We just think it's a paradox because no one came up with my answer before. But now that I have an answer, it should be obvious.
right, okay. So what I really wanted to talk about
Okay, one
was
per time, my friend.
no. I was just responding to I
Oh
was
boy.
responding to
I'll
the
give you a bye because you're moderating.
thank
You
you.
can do
Thank
that
you. I
though.
really wanted to talk
Go
about
ahead.
I really
You have
wanted
four
to
hands
talk
up.
about Gödel and the thing because
Yeah,
I'm still not grasping Gödel. So
yeah.
as far as I understanding, you're saying like because we cannot know the whole truth, then it's
Not
got to
about our
exist.
knowledge. Not about
Okay,
our knowledge. It's about the knowledge of the laws of physics themselves
got it.
and the actions of the laws of physics themselves. And essentially, what it says is that if the laws of physics are the only thing determining the next moment in time, the laws of physics can answer every answerable question if the universe is all physical. If there's nothing metaphysical about the universe at all, then the only answers that exist are the mass energy configuration of the universe at the next moment in time.
So could there be any laws of physics that have yet to be discovered?
This isn't about the laws of physics that we know today. This is about the theoretically possible laws of physics that could ever be discovered. It's about logical
Right,
systems in general. So the only
right. Which I
way that
guess
you get an out is if you say the laws of physics are changing constantly and there's no consistent set of laws of physics, which we kind of know is not true. Like
right.
Now, some people might want to make that argument in desperation to try to prove that we don't have free will and say, oh, it's more likely that the laws of physics constantly change than that we have free will. Sorry, I don't buy that argument. I'm not going to debate with that person because I
No,
just consider
I
that,
agree. Yeah,
yeah.
but the only comment I had was about the God of the gaps, and that's really the main point.
Yeah,
As far as I know, the God of the gaps was always what we cannot explain through science, we have to assign to God, and therefore it
correct,
proves that God exists.
correct.
And when you look at the history of our civilization from the caves to now, as we're talking in Zoom, you mentioned computers or science, right? We've always had a God explanation that then was proven by science. And we have a consistent history of this, right?
Yes.
Because of that, we know that any God of the gaps that we have today will be explained by science in the future because we have a consistent history. We've never had something that was
So
science. We never had something that was science that then was said, oh, it's got to be God.
Why is that necessary though, for science to be the arbiter? Like it's not necessary.
Well, it is because people put God as the explanation.
What's wrong with that explanation?
Pretty much the history, the dark side of the universe.
well, I mean, now we're arguing about whether or not religion is a net positive or negative on the world, and that's a different debate for another day. It's a good
It is,
topic.
that's true.
It's a good
It's
topic.
true. I agree.
Um,
Yeah.
but
But it
I
kind of
think
makes
I
him
think
tell
his
me.
point is that even if, and I agree with what you're saying, Carl. I think so much has been explained by God that now can be explained with science, that it's
Yeah.
very easy for us to say what you just said, and I think most scientists would, that science will eventually explain it all. But what we learned from Gödel with the argument I gave tonight, if you followed it and agreed with it, or if you at least followed it and if you could followed it and found a flaw, definitely raise your hand and tell me the flaw in my argument. But if you
Yeah.
followed it and agreed with it, I think I made a pretty good argument that even perfect knowledge of all the laws of physics will not necessarily tell you exactly what's happening in the future with 100% certainty. And so there's always wiggle room. And
Mm,
there are things that science will never prove true, like the flavor of ice cream that I feel like the most at a moment in time. Like science can't prove that true or false. I just prefer one over the other.
right. Okay. I still don't understand it, but I'm going to work on it.
I'll put the Gödel question again in the chat, and then I can talk about the problem transformation. If you want to raise your hand again, I can go over that, but we have a lot of hands up. So,
Yeah.
Josh.
Yeah, thanks. Uh, you seem to be using mathematics as the model for science and physics as the ultimate science. And generally, the social sciences tend to be, from that point of view, considered to be weaker or inadequate because they can't use the kind of precise mathematics that the physical sciences can. But I think that has it backwards. That we got it into our heads that this model of mathematical logic is the end all and be all. That must be what the universe. That's the language of the universe. No, it's the language of our concoction because it was convenient for us to build things on the basis of that construction. But we confused our own construction with the way things are. But I think the way things are is that relevance and changes in sense are important. For example, if you look at Gödel's hypothesis here, an axiomatic system, is a way of putting things together, right? And so when you change, when you change the axiomatic system, you're starting over again. So when Gödel, relies on his mathematical Platonism, says, well, there's a God behind it because I'm convinced that something is true, even if you can't prove it, because you have to have this infinite regress of axiomatic systems. He's still assuming that you are operating within the same sense, the same qualitative way of understanding the phenomenon. But when you go from one system to another, you're changing the rules. You're not operating within the same world, so to speak. And
Let
so it's
me
apples.
let me see.
It's
I'm
apples.
having trouble
Yeah, go
following
ahead.
having trouble following you. So, um, are you saying that you think Gödel made the argument that I'm making tonight?
Uh, I thought that he was leaving open an opening for you to make your argument. The gap is
I
that
use Gödel's incompleteness theorem to create the argument tonight, but it's not Gödel's argument. It's my argument. I'm just using Gödel's first incompleteness theorem to make the argument. But he didn't. I don't think Gödel would have agreed that the God of the gaps argument was a good gap. I don't even think he understood that level of implication to his theorem.
but but he was a Platonist, right? He believed that these things were true, even though you
Right.
couldn't prove them formally, right?
Um,
That's what he said, and he believed in that kind of a God. It was, he
no,
was grounding.
he didn't say anything about God. That I'm
Yeah,
aware of.
according to Roger Penrose, he did.
Okay, maybe he did. Well, I don't know anything that I'm not saying that Gödel said anything about God. I'm not making claims there because I don't know about that subject.
Oh,
So
okay,
yeah.
okay. I thought you were, empathizing with him, and
I
I can see how.
apparently am. I just didn't know I
Yeah,
was. So
yeah. You're
yeah.
making the point independently of
Yes.
yeah, yeah. Okay,
Yeah, and the argument applying Gödel's incompleteness theorem to the laws of physics is one that I've never seen anywhere else. That's one that I came up with to defend, like in basically, when I learned about Gödel's incompleteness theorem, that was the first place my mind jumped immediately. And so I was a determinist atheist, and I tried to go about proving Gödel wrong because he shattered my idea of the world that science could eventually prove true everything that's true. And then, like I said, Gödel won after many hours of studying Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And so here I am now defending free will and that there could be an explanation other than the laws of physics that actually explains things better than the laws of physics in this narrow, not super narrow because personal preferences are part of what I think falls into that category. So does that make sense?
yeah. Yeah, yeah. But it seems to me that you're doing a kind of a Cartesian thing, Descartes, where your free will involves what humans do when we use our will, and you're separating that off from, let's say, the mechanical universe. That there's a mechanical universe, and that's fine, and logic and mathematics do very well with that. And then there's the realm of human will, and that's a separate space, and that's where unpredictability comes in. That seems to be the split you're making. Whereas
Yeah.
I would be more inclined to put that unpredictability back into the world itself, outside of the realm of human will, and including human will, but not restricted to human will.
I don't
I
restrict
would,
it to human will. Like there could be randomness. I am agnostic on whether or not there's true randomness in the universe outside of human will. I honestly don't
okay,
know, and I can't make a good argument for or against it, so I'm agnostic on that.
okay,
I
cool,
can't make a good argument for human will. Um, so I make an opinion. I have an opinion on that one. Yeah. Does that make
okay,
sense?
thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Thanks. Great question, Josh. And I hope I understood you well enough to communicate with you. So, Derek, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess kind of similar to Josh. I was with you. It was very fascinating, great presentation. Great nutcase, in a nutshell, or wrap up of Gödel. Um, However, when you started talking about like instinct and gut, I'm wondering how you made the leap from that to trusting your gut. And then also before that, preamble before that was saying how science is the most reliable system we have for revealing truth in here. Then to go into the gut when your gut can often, like most of science is disproving our gut, like us orbiting the sun versus the sun orbiting us. It looks the
Right.
same. Intuitively, you would think the same until you actually look at it. So so much of our intuitiveness is wrong. And also, I guess piggybacking off of him, how do you make the leap from Gödel's incompleteness to that? I see how it opens up the door for free will. I just don't know how you sort of encapsulate it into your personal philosophy other than it's just an opinion. I just wouldn't make the leap from that to saying, therefore, like
Yeah.
to his point, I don't know how you get out of the mechanics and saying the incompleteness means that it's applied to human mechanics. And then when you went into the soul and everything, basically soul and personality, everything that we know about it is based on our material being. I'm open to the idea that there's more to the physical reality. I just don't know. I would be agnostic on that based on the information that you laid out. I just don't know. I would like you to explain how and where more distinctly you tied those two things together.
Sure. So we covered that another night, but I'll cover it quickly now if that's okay. But first, let me answer your question about gut instinct versus science. And shoot, now I forgot the other thing that I was going to come back to. Let me come back to it later. Um, so I think it's a fine balance, and that's why I said like confirmation bias is strong. We have to be sure that we're combating our confirmation bias actively. And if we're actively combating our confirmation bias, we're trusting science when it has good answers, and we don't have a good answer to something, then I would argue like trusting your gut is the best thing you can do. And I would say that if you're so basically it's a time where you don't have a good answer for something anyway. So at that point, trust your gut, trust your intuition, and just make the best decision you can. What else are you going to do? Paralysis of analysis?
Yeah, but to me, that's no different than flipping a coin, and you would
Oh
call
no, I
whatever you
disagree.
decide. You would call whatever you decide upon going with your gut. Because I've had situations where going my gut, it's like 49-48. But like,
So then it's a
but
competition of like gut instinct, right? If your intuitive truth is X and someone else's Y, it will be a competition between the two to see who emerges as the supreme one. And you have to hope on faith that the one you're propagating or advancing is the one that succeeds. And that's a power, that's a function of your power as the speaker and the quality of the truth that you're promulgating.
And
I
I'll
want
say
to be,
one more thing to that. Like
go ahead.
my gut instinct, it would be tied to my environment, my upbringing, and my material being. So you think it's subjective or something ethereal, but it could just be the basics of my mechanics.
No, so that's the argument I give defending free will is that it's a logical argument defending free will, not a faith-based argument. So I can logically defend free will, not believe it based on faith. So I can go into that once we get through hands, but we have a ton of hands up. So let's come back to that one. Carrie, go ahead.
All right. So I think the problem that we've got here is Gödel doesn't say anything about reality. He's just talking about systems and descriptions and statements and claims, which is a completely different thing, right? We're talking, that's the whole point of the truth machine is you're asking it questions.
Mhm.
Well, truth statements aren't real. Knowledge isn't reality per se, right? These things, does an idea or the experience of an idea have weight and form and substance and whatnot? I mean, this is, yeah, getting into the consciousness thing. Sorry about that.
Okay.
But it's this idea that, just think of it in terms of language. Language doesn't necessarily correlate to the world. It might have an association. We hope
Doesn't
it
it
correlates.
have a method of communication, whether it's sound waves or whether it's, typed data, or isn't there a physical equivalent of communication?
Well, what do you think the accuracy is of communication? I mean, because I can just say that words have to be fuzzy, otherwise no one could learn language. There'd be no way to define a word,
Well,
right? There
words
has to
are
be
fuzzy, but
overlap.
what way do you have to communicate that's better than using words and sounds?
I'm not saying we have anything better. I'm just
Well,
saying when we
and it's
come
the
up
worst
with
form of communication except for every other one.
correct, but that's why
But
Gödel was right, right?
well, no. So I think though you're right. Gödel doesn't say anything about reality. I'm the one making the argument that if you take the laws of physics themselves and turn them into the universal truth machine, you can translate Gödel's knowledge base into the physical universe, and that's what makes it a novel argument defending that we have free will, quite frankly. But that for another day. But the point is that translating it to the physical universe is the unique sort of spin that I put on Gödel's theorem.
Okay, let me try this one angle and see what you think.
Sure.
So if you have your truth machine, the reason that the question is paradoxical is because the truth machine has to answer it for itself. What if the truth machine is a little bit more flexible in design and can bifurcate itself? So you can have half A and half B, which become independent, or two truth machines. And truth machine A can talk about truth machine B.
But that's not a
Right?
universal truth machine anymore because if
Well,
it's
all right, well,
universal,
then we'll
you
do
can
the
answer questions
bifurcation
for everything.
where we can say the subset of this truth machine. Now, all of a sudden, the paradox disappears.
But then it's no longer a universal truth machine either. So the paradox disappears, but so does the universality.
But
Throwing
not
the baby
the
out with the
validity
bathwater.
of the answer, which makes the machine more valuable and more
No, because
functional.
you have two different.
Guys, I don't want to interrupt, but this is the greatest conversation I've heard all day. So please keep going because it's really tight.
You have two different truth machines then, right? And neither one of them is universal. They are each answering for themselves in their
Well,
set of domain, which science is
so
really
so wait a minute. Wait,
answering.
wait. Where's the rule that says we can only have one universal truth machine? Why can't we have 100 of them?
Well, if either one of those was a universal truth machine, it would have to be able to answer for itself as well as for other universal truth machines.
But it could say, I cannot respond, but that one can, as
Then it
to me.
then it's not universal.
Okay. So to be universal, it wouldn't be it couldn't carve out a subset of itself. So the boundaries of the universal
And
truth machine aren't the box it's contained in.
it can carve out a subset of itself. And if science carves out a subset of itself, which basically I'm making the argument tonight that the subset of itself is to explain the physical universe. And so if you're talking about science explaining the physical universe, it's really good at that. Now, I would argue that there's more than the physical universe that exists. And if my argument using Gödel's incompleteness theorem on the universe as the laws of physics as the universal truth machine is right, more than the physical universe has to exist because the next moment in time does come. And we know that there's answers to it. So something is determining what happens in the next moment in
Oh,
time. And if
yeah,
it's
but
not the laws of physics, then what the hell is, right? Like so
well,
so
here's the
something
thing.
else is.
What is a law of physics? Is it the reason that, the cause of things? I mean, now we're getting pretty heady stuff when we use, again, words to describe things that we really don't have access to.
Well, again, to say we don't have access to it and to say that there's we already agreed that words is the best way we can describe stuff. So if you want to try to find a way to describe stuff without words, pictures, diagrams, numbers,
You could
then
be
go
it.
ahead.
You could
What's
be
that?
it. You could be it.
What
If
do you
you
mean?
were the thing, the phenomenon you're describing, and you were aware of it, God,
Mhm.
then you would have a perfect understanding.
Perhaps.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. John, go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't have much of a question left, but can you just be a little bit more explicit as to how this failure of the universal truth machine tends to increases the chances of a God? I know you said there could be kind of like other explanations
Well,
to
anyone can give any explanation they want for something that there's no clear answer to, right? And that's where I said you can describe you can come up with your answer from whatever reason or way you want. So if you want to, and that's where I say trust your gut at that point, and go with what your gut says, rather than necessarily a a paradigm. Although if you want to trust your religion answers at that point, great, trust your religions. If you want to trust your spirituality, cool. But the way that it opens an answer to the opening for God and the way that I can defend God logically is if I'm right that more than that the laws of physics themselves are not a universal truth machine, then there has to be something other than the laws of physics determining the next moment in time because we know it comes about. And if that's the case, then that opens the door for a metaphysical spirit. If we have a metaphysical spirit, well, it's hard to imagine that's a one-time use thing, like throwaway after 100 years at best. So to me, that's probably gonna last. Well, regardless of whether or not you think it's 100 years or not, if it's a metaphysical spirit, where the hell did it come from? Right? Like, how does a metaphysical spirit evolve on Earth? Like, it can't just evolve from nowhere. Like, we're talking about a physical universe that we're aware of, that Earth is physical, and it's only existed for 8 billion years. How does something metaphysical evolve in 8 billion years? And I can't imagine a way that a metaphysical thing could evolve. It has to come from another metaphysical thing. And so that's where I would say God and the universe have both existed infinitely, and our spirit ultimately comes from God one way, shape, or form. But that's a whole argument that we could spend a whole night on. So, but I want to answer the questions because although we have a lot of them, so I want to, if you have questions, like clarifying questions, ask, and then we
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting argument, but do you think it could be stated that this itself is a form of God of the gaps? This because we lack the logical capacity as a species to answer these kind of questions, which in 1,000 years we might gain. So
sure,
this
sure,
form of
that's
reasoning is
possible.
itself God of the gaps.
That's possible, but remember, I'm making an argument that the God of the Gaps argument is a good argument. I think, though, that I gave a logically consistent argument that is consistent with the laws of physics, consistent with science, consistent with hard sciences, with math and physics. And so I think it's a pretty solid logical argument that'll stand the test of time. Now, we'll see if humanity lasts long enough for that to either even stand the test of time. But if, I think it will. I don't think it's a faith-based argument, which is what most God of the Gaps arguments are. They're, I have faith that it will, that it will be this way, but not a logical reason for believing it. I think I have a logical reason for believing what I do. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank
Steve,
you.
yeah, thank you, John. Steve, go ahead.
Okay. I thought I'd try to point out a ubiquitous presumption that it seems to go with that question. And this relates to the God of Gaps argument. And that presumption is that reality comes about autonomically and unintentionally by certain factors. We usually call those laws and or chance. So that seems to be like the ubiquitous presumption with God of the Gaps. But that's not really the only alternative. The other thing I'll say is often science is tied to that. Science is about these non-intentional autonomic factors creating reality. And so obviously you get the God of the Gaps argument. But there are alternatives to that where every event in the cosmos is both intentional and non-autonomic, free to some extent. Here's a couple examples. So process philosophy. In process philosophy, every occasion of experience is lured by God and responded to by finite reality. So it's all intentional. In fact, Whitehead talks about, he doesn't talk about laws, he talks about habits. There are habits, and we call them laws. So that's one example. We've got some other ones like Donald Hoffman. Maybe some of you guys are familiar with him, philosopher and psychologist. And his hypothesis is that based on physics and math, there's a prominent physicist that supports this, is that space-time itself is created by a network of intentional agents, and possibly even interchange like the one intentional agent. So that's another example. And then we have a wide range of idealism, metaphysical idealism throughout the world, particularly in the East, but even now with panpsychism and cosmopsychism, where reality is fundamentally mind. So it's intentional. So in all those cases, we don't have to have a God of the Gaps because we don't have these autonomic, non-intentional factors that create reality. There's something else that's intentional, perhaps free. So I just thought I'd try to point that out.
So in panpsychism, I don't see how like just take that as an example because it's the one of the things you mentioned that I know the best. I don't see how you don't have a God of the gaps argument in panpsychism. You're saying that everything is conscious, but there's still what science proves true and what science has not proven true. And for what science has not proven true, you're still saying, well, the gods, the conscious entities decided to do that thing that I don't have an explanation for. So I think there's still a God of the gaps argument in, I believe, all of the examples you said. Either there's not, or maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Well, the question is, what is it that constitutes reality? Or is it these autonomic, non-intentional factors, laws of physics or whatever? They're all non-intentional. They're all autonomic. Is that what constitutes reality,
Are
or is it
you
something else?
are you arguing against an objective reality that we live in?
Absolutely not. I mean,
Okay.
well, it depends on what you mean by that. But like take idealism, for instance, which I gravitate towards. There is an objective reality, but it's based on a mind, and in my case, a divine mind. Where think about this in a sense like J.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis or Rawlings. They created these worlds, these fantasy worlds in their mind, in their
Yep.
one mind. It's real. It's a real world, but it's in the mind. So, and everything that happens in those worlds, those fantasy worlds, is intentional by the author. So there's nothing autonomic about it. It's all intentional.
I guess that world is a subset of our world of objective reality, and it's passed from one mind to another. There's no actual physical, Sauron or armies of Mordor on Earth, right? Like, so that's not real. It's imaginary, and
Well, what do
As
you
far
mean
as
by
we know,
real?
like
What do
it's
you mean
not
by
a
as
part
far
of
real?
as
our
we
it's not a part of our objective physical universe. That's why I was saying it
Well,
seems like you're questioning whether or not we live in an objective physical universe. And I would argue we are part of an objective physical universe. I don't want to debate that tonight because that's a whole nother subject. But I think if what you're saying is that we may not live in an objective physical universe, then you're right. You could have other paradigms for coming to conclusions. I believe so strongly that we live in an objective physical universe that I don't find it fun to debate anymore. So I have an argument defending that even if we don't live in an objective reality, the winning strategy is to treat the world as if we do. And so ever since I made that argument, it's no longer interesting to me to debate because it's like, well, if the winning strategy is to treat it as if it's objective reality, then I'm going to treat it as if it's objective reality.
I agree. It is objective, but it's in the mind. That's all. That would be
Okay,
my one comeback.
cool. Thank you, Eugene. You're on mute, Eugene.
Okay. So Gödel theorem has two parts. First one, that formal system capable of representing whole numbers must contain true statements that cannot be proven within the system. So from this point of view, when we're talking about physics as a science, we have to allow that there are true statements which physics cannot prove.
Right.
So these observations without theoretical background. And second part, such system cannot prove its own consistency, which means that we cannot know whether statements which are provable are true or not. But when I make a step back, I understand that these two theorems are based on this approach and this logic. And there is maybe other approach, another logic, which would come to different conclusions, which will be able to include all possible outcomes and explanations, validations of their truthfulness, and consistency. So the second system, which would appear on the new approach when I made a step back, is God, which includes physics with unprovable statements and unprovable consistency.
I didn't understand the last sentence.
So so Gödel came to these conclusions from this type of logic. And I'm stating that there is a possible existence of other logic from which everything can be proven and from which everything which can be proven has consistency, which completely explains everything. And that position is position of God. So from this point of view, physics is just only part of this bigger system. And because it's part of bigger system, it cannot provide consistency and cannot be proven.
Right.
And there is no gap.
Well, I think what you're saying is that there could be another logical system that that is a universal truth machine. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and we can call it God.
So I think it's possible that God himself could answer true everything that's true, but not through how do I say this? I have another argument on higher dimensions, which is also in the FTI archives for anyone that wants to look it up. And essentially, I think I forget the exact number of dimensions, and it's going to change because I actually learned more from my presentation on time. But essentially, if God is a higher dimensional being, he can answer true everything that's true, including what my favorite ice cream flavor is, because he's like a sixth dimensional being, essentially, sixth or seventh dimensional being. And so it's possible that God himself can answer all those things, but it's impossible for us to know all the answers to those things, at least to the degree that we understand reality today. And that's the best I can do, is to explain what I understand about reality today and try to move it a few steps forward. I'm an inventor, so I do try to do that. But like, it turns out, by the way, for the person who was talking about Gödel's belief in God, I ChatGPT'd it, and it turns out that he actually created an ontological proof of God's existence that he never published because he was afraid of being ridiculed. So now I'm super curious whether or not I rediscovered Gödel's proof of God. So I'm going to have to look that up and look at it and see if we agree with each other. If I agreed with him, since he came way before me. But Eugene, I'm agreeing with you, I think. I just don't think that we can necessarily know exactly what that logical system says, at least not with our knowledge of the universe today.
Well, I agree with that, but I don't agree with your first statement that God is being in some dimension. I think the God is all-inclusive.
Okay. Well, then you would say
and it has different properties. One of them to be automaton, which develops itself into something else. And that prevents having any gaps, because any gap we point with a finger is just animalization of the world, dividing it for God as being to some degree, imagining to have some human features, at least to be creator, and non-God to be a science. There is no difference. Everything is God, and there is no gap.
Well, if you take science as we understand it, science is a logically consistent set of rules of inference, like Gödel's theorem proves. So if we take science as we understand it today, even with ultimate knowledge of everything it can prove, it does fit the first of Gödel's two incompleteness theorems. So I do think there is a gap. And even if you don't agree with that, even if you believe that eventually it can prove true, everything is true, certainly today we know there are things that are not common knowledge by science. There's lots of undiscovered territory, and there's always a God of the gaps there. Whether or not you agree that I can defend that in the long term is, we can agree to disagree on, but you have to agree that today there's knowledge that we don't know. There's things we don't know.
Well, we're discovering things only because we don't know full semantic network. We're always discovering something which is at the edge, constantly increasing its size. This is what discovery is.
Mhm.
But it doesn't, it's not proof that science is consistent and explains everything.
Right, that's exactly what I'm arguing, is that science is not consistent or it is consistent but cannot explain everything. That it is consistent but can't explain everything, even eventually.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Lady Calamity.
Yeah, I think I have a good argument for God that is logically defensible. So I think if we accept that reality in the moment or consensus agreement between two people, like if I say two and two is four and you agree with me, I'm the God that's speaking the truth, you're submitting to it. And then whatever, subjective, secretive, internal mythologies I have to explain the world, whether that's Buddha or Allah or, the Morgan or God, that's my spirituality that is succeeding in the moment. Whatever the actual um banality or like simplicity of the sign being offered, like two and two is four and accepted, that's the will of my God succeeding. And because like if you believe that God's plan is like reified in the moment, that's the truth, or like the truth of like Spinoza and God and nature is in the moment, then it must be whose ever truth is proffered and accepted is the right one. Um, and I think that doesn't exclude the possibility of free will. I was thinking about this the other day, like our gods must submit to our free will for that moment, but and they live like we do on however that truth is nudged. So we're all subservient to the choice of the pursuit of the good in the moment. It's just life will survive without us. But similarly, our gods or the stories that we tell ourselves require on our belief to survive too. So it's in our collective best interest to survive together. Sorry.
I do agree it's in our collective best interest to survive together. I'm curious why you would call someone God for saying two plus two equals four.
Because it's like it's a belief, just like all others. It's a strongly shared belief, right? But it's not an objective truth. So physics may say two plus two is four, and that's why we're here today, and that's the meaning of life. And most people would agree, but that doesn't make it true, right? It's just it can outcompete most other assertions that two and two is five. I don't have a stake in it one way or the other. I do, I
But when you
react in
say
I say what is true based on feeling in the moment. But right now, I'd agree with you that if you were like, what's two plus two? I'd be like, it's four.
right, but like
Yeah.
just being able to say two plus two is four, I don't think makes someone a god, right? It just makes them correct about a very small mathematical fact.
No, it does, right? Because I'm proposing a truth based
Right?
on what the previous moment in both your experience and mine demands of us, right? The state that existed, in the ever fleeting moment of the past. I'm proposing a truth which you can accept or reject based on what you think you believe about the world and what you think you believe about me and what you believe about yourself. But that doesn't make it true. It just makes it most likely, most probable, most convenient for right now. And why bother arguing about it anyway? It's a simple thing.
Right. All I'm saying is that I wouldn't call I mean you're trying to define God in a way that I just don't agree with, I guess. I think, God, for me, God is the origin of the metaphysical spirit. And so I see that
No, but like if God is the truth that we can never know, right? If that's what God is.
Right.
And the truth that we can never know is also expressed in a consensus agreement that we can never know between us.
But if we can
I'm
never
talking
know
to
it,
this
then
screen,
saying
you're
two and
talking
two
to
is four
yours.
isn't.
Then we are God's creating this moment. We are God's responsible for this moment. And it's like Foucault's like accretion of power. Like though I don't be like, the Morgan says the two and two is four, that's at the top of the pinnacle of my authority. And like would be like, oh, like, Galileo or whatever, whoever fucking math guy is at the top of my pinnacle for authority. We're invoking those gods in our value system expression. But I'll stop talking because I've said it before. And I'm enjoying the conversation immensely, though.
Good.
Thank you.
I'm glad. Thank you for your comments. Ron, how are you?
Good. Hey, it's nice to see you
Good to see you
again.
too.
Yeah. So I'm listening intently to this entire conversation and able to process about 10 or 15% of it at best. You guys think too quickly for me, but nevertheless, because I don't consider myself quite an idiot, I want to just in my minute or two that's left, just put forward a couple of little quick thoughts.
Hmm.
One is that what you're calling a universal truth machine might be a pretty convenient definition for God. But I would also say that because God has so much baggage and freight, I would drop the word God, and I'll fall back on a physicist, David Bohm, who worked with Einstein.
Hmm.
And his essential truth machine or God was what he called the implicate order. It was unmanifested, but it could be described as having infinite potential. And when that potential was manifested, he called it the explicate order. And what you and I are living in is what he would have called the explicate order. It arose from this implicate order. Now, what we're doing here is trying to, using the limited manifested tools of this explicate order, try to understand this unmanifested implicate order. Not possible. For example, I'll give you, for hubris here, we're basing so much of our arguments today on the importance of human beings on planet Earth who have beliefs. Among these beliefs are that there is such a thing as time, space, and causation. What if there's no such thing as time, space, and causation? And what if human beings, whether they continue to exist or not, are almost irrelevant to the creation? So, what I'm trying to get at is that we just, I don't know, we just kind of have to sit back and consider the possibility that something a lot larger, more inclusive than this small thing that we glorify as the brilliance of the human mind that will someday understand everything there is to understand. I think that's it's a lot of hubris there, and I'm going to stop because I wanted to keep my ideas fairly simple and make a one or two just crisp little points. And I know it's not a point of view that everybody's going to jump on, but some people might understand where I'm coming from anyway. But you can ask me or anybody ask me a question, but other than that, I'm done.
Well, I agree with you that we can basically reject the concepts of time or the era of time, space, and causation. I would argue maybe we are irrelevant to creation, but for now, I haven't found any good reason to doubt causality. I haven't had any good reason to doubt the existence of time space as a four-dimensional uh, space. And so I believe they're true until I'm proven something that says they're not. And if someone brings me something that says they're not, then I'll change my mind. But for now, I'm going to have my beliefs because I think they're on solid ground, and those are the solid ground that I think a lot of what I understand is formed on.
Fair enough, but quantum physicists they're getting closer and closer to agreeing that this virtual universe, that there is no such thing really as time and space, and Kant was on to that, 100 and some odd years ago, that these are just categories that the mind uses to navigate this explicate world. And if you explore the mystical traditions across the planet, across the millennia, you'll find out that this idea that there's this implicate order is all over the place once you know what you're looking for. And so it's not something that I just made up
No,
or,
no, I'm not saying it is. I don't know Bohm's hypothesis super well, but I believe that it comes what you're saying comes from him and it's his belief system. The idea of nirvana, is maybe like trying to achieve that ultimate state, but you know, I don't think any of the spiritual beliefs actually are at issue with like um space, causation, and time, at least not in a meaningful way. They just say that there's more to the universe than what we see on the surface, which I agree with 100%. There's more to it, and we haven't yet understood it all. And part of the reason that I even did tonight's presentation is because I think in order to understand it, we have to recognize the limitations of science itself and be able to expand our thought processes to include some level of spirituality, because I think it's logically defensible that spirituality is reality. It's far more likely to be reality than just the physicalist perspective of the world.
Well, the last thing I'll say very quickly is that I think basically what I was arguing for, I think you agree with. I think, if we had time to, deconstruct all this stuff, we would find a lot of agreement between us.
Yeah.
And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah,
Can I
I
ask
agree. Go
a
ahead,
quick
Carl.
question? Can I
Yeah.
ask a quick question for Ron? If he knows the answer, do you know if David Bohm was an atheist, or whether did he believe in God or not?
He
I'm
was
curious.
very spiritual person. He spent 20 years having dialogues with Krishnamurti. He was the
Krishnamurti,
Dalai
yeah.
he was the Dalai Lama's scientific. So
Right.
he had tremendous. But he was right there at the Manhattan Project. He was with Einstein. He was a brilliant quantum physicist, and his mind was so expansive that when he got kicked out of the scientific fraternity because he had a slight little dabbling in some Marxist stuff as a college student,
Right.
he turned his attention to the spiritual world, and that's where he came up with this whole cosmology of an implicate order, which is, if you've studied Eastern philosophy, it's Brahman, it's Tao, it's whatever you want to label it, but
Okay.
it's that spirit from which everything arises, including this creation and us human beings, et cetera, et cetera.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Derek, go ahead.
Yeah, so I know I got short time, so I'm gonna throw my critiques out at you and see
Please.
whatever you want to respond to. And then when I get on the mic, I freeze up.
I
However,
write notes, Derek, if it helps you. I'm literally writing notes this whole time so that I can reply to people. So
okay, cool. So again, as you just said there, you like to stay on solid ground. And I feel like your presentation for the most part was on solid ground. However, I feel like towards the end, you took leaps. And that's what I have critiques about. The
yeah,
leaps that you took off of solid ground onto what I feel like are just suppositions that you can't necessarily defend, i.e., the whole God thing. And to Carrie's point, the words and how we translate them, we're having disagreement about what God is. And to what Ron said, there's a lot of baggage with that word God that I don't think you're ready to defend. So it kind of like muddies the water of what you're calling God when you're trying to fill this hole from
yeah,
Gödel and filling it with God that we don't necessarily have a necessarily concept of. Comes with the baggage, like I said.
yeah,
However, my earlier point was, again, leaving from the solid ground. I don't know how you make that leap to free will, because that free will or determinism might be subsumed into what is verifiable truth, but that's not the whole truth. For example, you could use the universal truth machine to ask the question that you said that was the basis that led to your thesis. But you could also, right before it or after it, ask, do human beings have free will? And it could say no. So it may know truths, it doesn't know all truths, and free will doesn't necessitate having all truths. For example, you said that your whole presentation and why you made the leap was based on you're making a logical leap. So I would like to know if you could put it in a syllogism. I try to do my best I could and tell me if I'm right or wrong. I'll try to steel man it. It's bad language, so feel free to correct me. One, all truth is unknowable. Two, determinism is inseparable from all total truth. Three, therefore, determinism is false. I would disagree with that second premise. I don't know how you can justify that conclusion from
Say the
that.
second one again.
And then finally, determinism is inseparable from total truth. And then finally, I'll just throw this out. So then you left with that whole, which I think, again, is just you're doing the God of the gaps, which you said you didn't deny. However, if the God of the gaps that you're advocating fills that hole and has total truth, then again, I think you're just kicking the can down the road. How then do you justify free will? If that is all knowing and it knows everything that you could do, then how do you justify free will at that point? Because that becomes the ultimate UTM. And if it knows everything about you, even to ways that you don't know, then how do you justify free will in that case? I think I got it all in. Thanks.
Good, within 3 seconds. Um, you asked multiple questions, Derek, which you're killing me with, but let me try to answer what I can. First of all, there is a lot of baggage with the word God. That's why I very quickly said I'm not trying to defend the God that most religions believe exists, the omnipotent, benevolent God. I think Epicurus did a great job proving he doesn't exist. I make an argument that God is benevolent and powerful, not that he's omnipotent. And I guess the only thing I can really like solidly defend is that God is the origin of our metaphysical spirit. And that I defend by saying we have a metaphysical spirit, and how could something metaphysical exist without having an origin that is metaphysical? And so I call the origin of that metaphysical spirit God. Now, why do I believe that we have a metaphysical spirit? Well, this is the argument that I think I didn't explain well enough for you to understand. And essentially the idea is if the universal truth machine, let's assume there's something called a rule, a proof by contradiction. If you assume something is true and then you run into a contradiction, then the thing that you assumed was true is not true. Essentially, if you assume that we have a universal truth machine and that the universal truth machine is the very laws of physics themselves, not our understanding of them, but the laws of physics themselves, then there's only one possible, future in the universe because determinism is right, but that universal truth machine is what we've disproven by Gödel's first incompleteness theorem. And so we know that by Gödel's first incompleteness theorem that the laws of physics themselves cannot be a universal truth machine, because if they were, they would violate Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And well, Gödel has a very good logical argument that a universal truth machine can't exist. And the laws of physics, if determinism is right, is a universal truth machine, or are a universal truth machine. And so that's what I use to defend that the next moment in time has to come about because of something more than just the physical world. Because if only the physical world and the laws of physics were what determine the future, the laws of physics would be a universal truth machine. I hope that makes more sense. And I'm sorry if it doesn't, but I do want to get to some other hands and then we can come back to it if it still doesn't make sense. Tone.
Yeah, so thank you. The conversation has gone so many ways, trying to figure out where to pick it up.
Wherever you want.
First comment I would make, just since it's recent, is this idea of the laws having to submit to Gödel's incompleteness theorem. I see how that could happen, but it seems you would have to think the laws in some sense are coded axioms, because Gödel's incompleteness theorem is about axioms. But that assumes that in some sense, in some very explicit sense, it's a primitivist view of laws. If you took more of a Humean view, so the
No,
laws are merely regularities that we describe, I don't see why that would
just
necessarily have to submit to any theorem.
yeah, just want to stop you there because the laws are not the axioms. The axioms are the state of the mass energy of the universe at a moment in time t. The laws themselves are the rules of inference. And so those are the logical rules that go from time t to t plus delta t, which is a Planck length of time later. And so the laws themselves are actually the logical rules.
But where are the rules?
Well, I mean, they're written in the universe, right? We don't know the exact laws of physics, but all that we understand is that
No,
our
I understand what you're saying, but no, I understand what you're saying. But the subtle point is that I'm saying just when you said they're written in the universe, I just wanted to clarify. You're saying that the laws in some sense are coded axioms. It doesn't mean it has to be wrong. I'm
no,
just
not
making a
axioms,
distinction.
not axioms, rules of
That's more of a
inference.
primitivist view of laws.
No,
That's
no,
saying the laws just exist.
no. Well, I mean, yes, I do think the laws just exist. I mean, we don't have any reason to believe that the laws of physics themselves have an origin. I don't think they do have an origin. I think they're infinitely existing. And I think the mass energy state of the universe is infinitely changing. So I do think they infinitely exist. I don't think they're if you have an origin story for the laws of physics, I would love to hear it.
I don't even think that it makes sense to put temporal language on things about the existence of the universe. Like, I think the universe would just be outside of temporal language. There's no extension in time. I think that's a concept that we have. But just to keep it germane to the point, I guess the only thing that I was saying, I found what you said fascinating. So, not finding a problem with it. I'm just saying, if you take more of a Humean view and say that all we are doing is describing regularities, I'm just making the point that makes it harder to make some of these arguments. A lot of your arguments, they're very computational. You have to believe that the laws in some sense are computationally bound versus saying they're just regularities that we are compressing. That's the point.
We're observers of the laws, and I will forever blame Hume for convincing so many people that, including myself at one point in time, that of what's it called? Free will that's not free. Um, shoot. I don't know why I'm blanking on it. It's been a long day. Basically saying free will and determinism are compatible. Compatibilism. He was the guy that started compatibilism, and I will forever blame him for that because I think so many people have a misunderstanding because of him in that area. So that's the thing that I know best about him. So I can't comment on your other points other than to say I do think that the laws of physics are really the logical steps going from point point t in time to t plus delta t. And so it's not while I do agree that they're kind of rote, I don't agree that time is just a human construction. Like we can scientifically and objectively observe time and lots of things about it. So if you have an explanation for why we observe time and it's not a physical trait of the universe, I would love to hear what that explanation is, but raise your hand for that for another time because I do want to get to
Sure.
other people. Joshua Pace, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. This has been a fantastic conversation. If you'll bear with me, I kind of was interested in taking a slightly different tack on this discussion. And I wrote it down, so I'm just going to read what I wrote real quick.
Yeah.
My question here is, has the relative failure of the God of the gaps argument from deists to explain objective reality created an irrational intellectual bias against any rational non-theistic argument for the possibility of intelligent design or intelligent designers? Now, the reason I ask this question is that I think we're in a very fascinating point in history where we are on the verge of creating superintelligence. And if we are successful in creating an intelligence that can self-evolve over geologic time, not just human time, if we are on the verge of creating this, are we not creating gods? Are we not so? And if we are, I mean, I imagine that given enough time and a sufficiently intelligent AI could, or a whole community of these AIs could inevitably evolve to the point of being a Kardashev type 3 civilization or beyond, right? So does that possibility of artificial superintelligence being a not just a possibility, a reality in today's world, does that not lend some measure of weight or of an intellectual weight to the idea that intelligent design is not this theological kind of mysticism, but rather a scientific argument? So I guess my question, going back to this idea of the failure of the God of the gaps argument up till now, has that biased the intellectual discussion against any rational intellectual design argument? That's kind of where I was thinking. Did that make sense? I don't know if that made sense.
I didn't quite follow. I was following you from the point of, does the failure of theists to make a good argument for God of the gaps argument, which I agree with that 100%. They've made a very bad argument for God of the gaps. They've misused the argument in many respects. I don't see how you get from that to an irrational logic against intelligent design.
Sorry, yeah. Let me clarify. I'm speaking when I talk about an irrational argument or perspective, I mean the bias from the scientific community regarding the intelligent design as being a plausible explanation for some of objective reality. The mere fact that we are the intelligent designers.
Got it.
We are creating a superintelligence.
Right.
Does that
I think you're right. I think you're right that it does create a harder argument for someone to argue intelligent design. I will agree with you there. I am not going to try to defend intelligent design because I think evolution is much more defensible. But I will say that the way that what I would say that the theist argument has done is made a poor case for spirituality, and that we inherently, I believe, as a spiritual being, have a desire to see, ourselves and those we can influence be happier and achieve their goals and help. I think we all have an inherent desire to prevent significant unnecessary harm. And I think we all have a desire to prevent significant harm from happening, or harm from happening to ourselves and those that we can influence. And I would argue those are spiritual truths that we all have one way or another. And I think any disagreement is more semantic than it is actual. And so I think that theists have made it hard to argue for spiritual truths, which I agree 100% with. As far as whether or not AI can become super intelligent, I didn't specifically say tonight, but my background is AI. Like, I was in AI concentration and computer science, and I built AI algorithms my whole career. I will say that AI as we know it doesn't have a spirit, and if AI is ever created that thinks that it does, I think we're all in for a world of hurt, because it'll be thousands of times smarter than us and unlikely to be more moral because it doesn't have that inherent desire to increase happiness and decrease harm. And even though we do have that inherent desire, think about how we treat things 1,000 times less smart than us, like ants, for example. Not so well. We don't create ant paradise for them. So I don't think things are going to look rosy for us if we create super intelligence that thinks it's sentient. And I did a whole nother event on pseudosentient AI. So I'll just leave that as a quick Cliff's Notes version of that night. And you can go back to the video if you want to get more in detail. I hope that answers your question. I kind of agree.
Yeah, I appreciate that response. I think, just to simplify, the point I'm trying to get to is just simply, if we are successful at creating God, does that not make God now suddenly a rational perspective? Because we have in fact created it.
I don't think we can create God.
Doesn't the end of evolution become, in a way, become like God is inevitable because here we are, right?
Well, I don't think that we are God, and I don't think that we can create God because we don't know how to imbue a living being with a spirit. And if
right. No.
Spirits...
I'm sorry, Garrett. I'm not trying to make the argument as to whether or not, I'm personally agnostic, meaning whether or not if you ask me what I believe about God, you have to first define it. Define what you mean, and then I'll tell you whether or not I believe it. Okay.
Right. I did do that,
So
by the way. I don't know if you believe what I said about God or not.
sorry, no. So I'm not trying to make any theological argument or metaphysical argument or anything of the sort. I'm just trying to get to this idea that if we are successful, regardless of how you define it, if we are successful in creating a God that has a spirit or what you would recognize as a spirit, then have we not demonstrated that intelligent design can be a logical conclusion?
But I
Because
think
if it
you're
could happen now,
assuming,
why couldn't it have happened billions and billions of years ago?
well, you're
The
assuming
same
though that
thing.
if we create an AI that it has a spirit, aren't you?
What's that?
You're assuming that if we create an AI that it has a spirit.
I am making that conclusion. I have my own
Yeah.
reasons to suggest to think that we can and will build an AI that has every bit of a moral foundation as we have. I think
Well,
I believe it's algorithmic, not metaphysical. So I believe it's very possible to create a super intelligence that is every bit as moral and perhaps even more moral than any of us are capable of. But that's my own
that,
personal argument. I
yeah.
won't.
I am not yet convinced. We can do that for another night. You should go back to our event talking about pseudo-sentient AI. And I think, I didn't, if you have an argument countering my ant argument, I would love to hear it in your next stand up. I'm happy
Absolutely.
if we don't have more questions on tonight's topic, although we kind of deviated, so I don't mind if we
I,
deviate a little more.
yeah,
That
no.
says,
But I'll yield the floor because there's more people that want to talk. So
great.
thank you.
Thank you. Steve, go ahead.
Okay, so if God is filling the gaps, then the next obvious question is how? What's happening there? So if we, in relation to, say, the so-called natural order, these, what I have said was autonomic, non-intentional factors, laws and chance and what. So the question is, well, if God's filling the gaps, what is God doing in relation to that? And so, is this an overriding of those laws? Is this an intervention of some sort? So that, the laws are rattling along normally, blah, 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 and then God steps in and no, we want to do this and this and this. So is that the case? And if that's the case, is this intermittent type of thing where God, okay, we'll just let things go on, but I want to do something different. So boom, I'll jump in here. And so I guess that's my question.
So, I think that it's not just God filling the gaps. All I'm saying is when we don't have a good answer from science, then we should trust our gut. And you can say that that gut is guided by God if you want to. Cool. I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm just saying that there will always be answers that science doesn't have an answer to, and there currently are, of course. So go ahead and answer those things with something else. But to answer your question about what fills the gaps, I think it's a combination of not just God, but any being with free will and randomness are both filling the gap for what's missing. I think, as beings with free will, we can only do what's in our control, right? And we know our sphere of control to some degree. We have a pretty good sense of it. And, I know I can't swim across the Atlantic Ocean. There's just no way. I'm not a good swimmer. So, and you'd have to be a really good swimmer to do that. So, there's certain limitations to our free will, even though we have it. And then the other thing is, go ahead.
So does that mean we're supernatural agents?
So
we're overriding the normal flow of natural
I was just
processes?
about to get to that. So
Okay.
yes and no. So the laws of physics explain the macro. They do not explain the quantum level fluctuations. And I did another event where I described the what I believe is the way that consciousness functions. And essentially what it is, if you look at the research by Dr. Stuart Hameroff and Sir Arthur Penrose, they traced consciousness back to microtubules or nanotubules, I forget which, the really small tubules in the brain that operate at a quantum level. And the part that confused them is what's the origin? They couldn't find the origin, and no one has been able to find the origin. And I think the reason is the origin is metaphysical. It's our spirit. And the spirit operates at a quantum level in those microtubules or nanotubules in the brain. And then the rest is known by science. But the problem is scientists disagree with spirituality, so they can't find the conscious the origins of consciousness because they're looking for something that they don't believe exists. They won't look for something that they don't believe exists. And so that's why they're stumped. And really, consciousness can be described as microtubule fluctuations, which culminate into using something called halon theory, which is like smaller parts becoming bigger parts. It describes how you get from nano to, or like quantum to higher level.
Yeah, sure, but yeah, I'm familiar with that. Sounds feasible, but the still question is related to what's the relationship of the, say, free will or God of the gaps to so-called natural processes. They're
Yeah.
rattling along normally, and then is this an intervention, a supernatural
Well, it's the same way that
intervention?
like
But now that would have to relate to the lower processes too somehow. Does that override all the way down? That
no,
sort of
so
thing.
the free will starts at the quantum level, but we can operate on the mechanical level using our free will. So, for example, there might be a river running through an area that someone wants to, shut the river off for a while. So they create a huge dam and they create a lake on top of the river and they only let the water down when they want. Well, that's free will interfering with physical processes. And I don't think we would disagree that that's free will interfering with physical processes. Like, that's not a natural process, a dam, right? But human beings can make it happen. And guess what? Ants can make things happen. They just make less influential things happen. And I think the humans, we did something right in a past life because we have significant influence in this life.
Well, personally, I believe in libertarian free will myself.
Cool.
But my point is that I think it has to go all the way down. Every event has to be intentional and free. Otherwise, you have this dichotomy that you have to deal with somehow. That you've got these non-intentional autonomic processes, you've got these free processes. How do they work together? Is this like boom? No. Yeah, that's
laws of physics determine what's possible, and quantum fluctuations
okay.
is the wiggle room that allows free will to operate. And if
Okay.
the explanation is correct, it creates wiggle room that can then scale to a macro level using that brain mechanism. And I think all living beings have that. AI does not have
Well,
that because it doesn't have the metaphysical spirit, which is why our lives are meaningful and an AI's life is not. I don't mind making the AI work super hard for no good reason, whereas I would mind making human beings work really hard for no good reason.
okay, well, I'll quit because other people are waiting, but still, I mean, so if this is why I think that the cosmos, every event's intentional in the mind of God, because otherwise you've got sentient beings that can affect quantum mechanics, and where does it happen, and what level organism do we get this stuff going on? And to me, it just seems like so much more complex than just saying that every event is intentional and free. Finite beings, however, have certain constraints within which their free will can operate, but everything's intentional. Simple solution. But I'll stop there so other people can
Yeah,
talk.
I agree it's simple, but I don't see how rocks could be making decisions. I haven't seen any evidence of that. So that's why I'm not a panpsychist, but
Well,
psychic.
that's why I said finite beings, rocks, don't have the free will like a human being does. I mean,
Okay.
process philosophy even talks about how inanimate stuff, atoms and stuff, actually are lured towards a certain event, and these become habits. So yeah, no, rocks don't have the same kind of free will.
Got
Okay.
it. Carrie, go ahead.
All right. So there's a lot of talk earlier about paradoxes, and I think there's something here. Because there was a guy named Zeno a long time ago who
Yes.
made an argument, right, that motion can't exist. And he did it with this very clever thing that you could divide spaces infinitely, right? And therefore, whatever distance is traveled, there's always, more and more divisions you could cram in there. And what's interesting about that is, we've kind of figured out why or where that logic went astray. And it's because boundaries don't exist. They're the absence of something, right? Divisions aren't real. So you can cram hypothetically as many divisions into a material space as you want because they don't take up any room, right? Now, obviously, motion does happen, but I think the question does, it begs the question whether boundaries actually exist. Because, this goes back to this idea: is there one substance, right? And when we start talk about things like, probability waves and a, grand unified theory or theory of everything or whatnot, especially when you're talking about quantum stuff, um, before wave functions are collapsed, at least from our perspective, they're kind of pervasive. And if they're all interrelating, it becomes impossible to really draw boundaries between anything, which is problematic for your truth machine. The other thing, with your universal truth machine, might it need a sixth dimensional language to convey some of these truths? Because if God is a sixth dimensional being, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are there things, if the truth machine, basically, would it have to teach you an impossible language to convey that truth that God can see? Is that the problem?
It would have to be inconsistent to prove to you what God can see. So it would have to deviate from its consistent set of rules. So it doesn't say that a universal truth machine can't answer true all truths. It's just that if it answers true all truths, it's also going to be wrong about some stuff. So if it's consistent, meaning it's accurate and answers all truths, then it's inconsistent. So one of two things are true. Either it's consistent and not complete, or it's um, complete and inconsistent.
Does
So
that work, though, for all possible forms of existence? Because this is a problem. We used to think things either existed or didn't exist. There wasn't this idea of this indeterminate Schrodinger's cat situation.
I do still think that things either exist or not exist, but only after they're measured are we able to determine if they exist or not exist. And I give an explanation for that, which is that the reason that it takes the actual measurement moment to know whether it exists or not is because something else's free will or your free will could impact it before you detect it. And so the reason you don't know if the cat is dead or alive is because, well, if the cat's alive, someone could kill the cat before you open the box. Infinitesimally quickly, before the light from the box gets to your eyes, they've killed the cat. And so you don't know if it's alive or dead until you check.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's actually an explanation for that. There's also an explanation for Zeno's paradox. If you agree with current science, the smallest possible length is a Planck length. So Zeno was actually wrong about his paradox. I personally actually will side with Zeno. I think that things can get infinitesimally small, but I can't logically defend that other than to say my gut is that why would there be a finite size, smallest size that exists? I think that that's just the limitations of what we scientifically know. I think someday we'll get to smaller. But that's just a gut instinct, which I'm using the God of the Gaps argument for. Sorry.
Oh, it's a fallacy, though.
I
It's
know,
not
right?
an
I know,
argument.
right? So,
Anyway, thanks.
I'm disagreeing with what's considered accepted science, which I do sometimes, but usually when I have a logical reason or a gut hunch. But in this case, I don't have a logical reason, just a gut hunch. And I haven't looked at Planck length well enough to know all the evidence supporting it and refuting it to make a good argument. So maybe that's a subject for another day if people are interested. Derek, go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, there's a lot on the table. I enjoyed this conversation, and everyone participating. However, so again, my critiques with it, for one thing, like I said, I think, so again, I'll just follow up from last time. A lot of solid ground, but then the leaps is what I'm gonna critique. So
Yeah.
for one, the God, like I agree with you. There are things we don't know. So I just don't know why it's not good enough just to say it. There are things that we don't know. And then, like you said, until you can measure it, then things
Well,
necessarily don't exist or don't exist in the way that we may intuit it to be. For instance, the God thing, you went from we all saying like you're using God as the placeholder, but then later on you went to say that it's you have beliefs that it's benevolent in this and that. How do you know
those
that
are
this
those
God,
are things
whatever
that
this
I don't
placeholder
expect you to
God thing,
believe. Yeah, Derek, I don't expect you to believe those
yeah,
things because I didn't
I
defend them tonight. But what I would encourage you to do is go back to other Freethinker Institute videos, start with defending free will, and then after defending free will, I have a couple on consciousness. And if you go through those, then I don't know if I ever gave my argument defending a logical higher power, and if I did, it was probably lost. But I kind of recapped it tonight with saying that, if determinism is wrong, then we have to have a metaphysical spirit, but I didn't give like a really detailed explanation for that. But what it turns out to be true, and I could send you the essays if you're interested in reading them, about why if we have free will, or why if determinism is wrong, it opens the door for free will, and if we have free will, we have a metaphysical spirit. And if we have a metaphysical spirit, how does such a thing evolve from a physical universe? Which means, it can't, is really the conclusion that I reached. And so the metaphysical spirit has to come from something else with a metaphysical spirit, which I call God. And I can't say, I can defend my belief that he's benevolent and powerful, but yeah, let's get to the other questions. And if you want in the
Yeah,
next hand,
I'll
I'll
put
do
that
that.
aside because that's the whole topic. Like I understand
Yeah.
that's a whole topic on another self. However, so to my point that there are certain things that we may not necessarily know. The other brother a few people ago was saying about the AI thing. How do we know that this, that, and the third? And you said, well, they can't necessarily have spirits. I don't know where you get that from. And I think his point, not to speak for him, but what I got of that is, how do we know that we weren't created and we're not AI, which you say we have spirits, but
There's a
you
movie
can't
about that,
necessarily.
by the way. I think it's called Her. The movie where like the person doesn't know if they're an AI or not. And
Yeah. And
um,
even beyond that, so
yeah,
the whole UTM thing, if you don't know, how do we not know that this is an illusion, this isn't a dream? Yada yada yada. I know
well,
you
we
don't
don't
have the
know,
answers
right?
for
But
that.
this is where I come back to like, the whether or not we live in objective reality. Like there are certain things that are just so like it would be so
Yes.
hard to follow the world at all just if you just chose not to use the concept of time or space, either one of them. If you reject the concept of time or space and apply that practically into your life, you wouldn't be able to survive like at all.
Yes,
Like,
solipsism is not
yeah.
practical, is not a practical
And
place.
so I focus on practical philosophy. And so for me, I believe those things are true. And so, yeah, I'm going to take them as an assumption because it's not practical to not take them as an assumption.
I'll leave this as a question for you to probably address in a future lecture, which I'm always interested in, which is, so your God that fills these questions, if it is all knowing, and if you consider it a being, does it know how to deceive itself? Then I come up with more paradoxes about your very being then. But that's a whole nother discussion. I think I've exhausted my
Yeah, I
my ball
mean,
game for today.
if God is all knowing, I would argue it would know how to deceive itself, but I don't think it would. Like, why would a benevolent, very powerful being deceive itself intentionally? Like
But if it
we
could be
could say,
deceived, then it would know it was being deceived, so then it couldn't be deceived. So you just right back to paradoxes,
yeah, that's
logical
the
paradoxes.
can God lift the rock that he,
Yeah, there's again none
yeah,
practical questions that are
yeah.
just that don't
Yeah,
have any
and
there's no point.
that's where I would argue that that only applies to an omnipotent God, and I don't believe the God that I defend is not omnipotent. He's
It's
powerful,
sufficiently
not
powerful.
omnipotent.
I got you.
Yeah.
That's another discussion. I look forward to it. Thanks.
Yeah, yeah, no
Yeah.
problem. Tone, go ahead.
Yeah, so to chime in on a couple things, one is I'd just like to hear a little bit more about this idea of spirits and gods. I understand that you're not using those words sort of in the traditional sense, so I'm definitely trying to give you leeway on that. I'm just trying to
God, I'm
understand a little
not.
bit more.
Yeah, spirit, I actually am probably not using it the way most people use it. It's just the closest thing that I can come to. All I would say is the spirit for me is the metaphysical. It's not made out of physical energy. It's not made out of physical mass energy, is the name we call it in physics. For everything from light to something that's completely solid and 0 degrees Kelvin in theory. That it's not made out of physical stuff. It is non-physical or metaphysical, and it is the essence of who we are as a person. Like we all have a sense of self. We all believe we are. I believe I'm Garrett. You believe you're Tone, right? And I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, am I?
Yeah, no, it's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, we all believe that we are a human being with a sense of self. Now, like that's what I mean by the metaphysical spirit is that it's the thing that we describe as us that I believe lives on after this life and gets reborn into another existence. And I defended that logically with peer-reviewed science, actually, which I didn't know about the peer-reviewed science until the first time I defended it logically with an a priori argument. And then someone goes, Garrett, this has been studied by science. And I was like, what? I wanted to study that, but someone beat me to it. So not only someone, hundreds of people have beat me.
Can I just ask a
Yeah,
clarifying question to see if
please
you mean the same thing just by a different term?
go ahead.
If I was to say that if you think about subjective experience, it would just be a dual aspect. It would be a different view, but nevertheless of the same substrate, right? So to say that if you look at a table, that would be a material view, but there would also be a dual view, which would be subjective. I, in that case, would not be using the word spirit. What I'm trying to figure out is, would you mean the same thing, or do you mean something over and above that when you
When
say
you say
spirit?
subjective experience and dual view, what do you mean by that?
I mean, right now we have a body, we have a brain, but there's no way that we know how the brain mechanistically would ever lead to a subjective experience. So one way of dealing with that is saying it simply is a brute fact that there is a dual view, which is a subjective experience. But only thing I'm trying to clarify is I would not call that a spirit. I would not call that that to me would be no more mysterious than saying that we see physical objects. So I'm just trying to figure out, is there something extra
Yeah,
that you
there is.
mean when you say
It's the
spirit?
metaphysical essence of ourselves. So if my argument is correct, which is that the laws of physics are not the sole determinant of the future, that opens the door for randomness and libertarian free will. And if libertarian free will has a possibility, I would argue that it behooves us to say, well, it's more likely to be true than not if it's not scientifically proven to be false, right? If we can actually logically defend that either our spirit is a bunch of randomness that happens to cleverly hide itself thinking that it's sentient. Like, why would that all happen to all of us at the same time? That we're all cleverly hiding our randomness to try to make ourselves think that we're sentient when it's just as equally possible, and actually, I would argue much more probably possible, that we have a metaphysical essence of ourselves that we will into being what we want to happen, to the extent that is physically possible.
So you think that the randomness actually translates into
No,
libertarian
I
free
don't think it
will?
is randomness. I think when you disprove determinism, you open the door for randomness and or free will. The one that I can logically defend the most is the libertarian free will. The randomness I think exists because it seems like it does. Like there are things like when a volcano erupts. Well, maybe if someone had a perfect model of the world that they would know exactly when a volcano is going to erupt, but it seems kind of random to me, and I would imagine that there's randomness playing into it, but maybe not. I don't know. Yeah.
At the quantum level, though, you do have, as far as we know, true ontic randomness, depending on your interpretation. I'm just trying to figure out where
No,
the
so that's
libertarian aspect would come from.
so that you're assuming that the quantum level fluctuations are random, but if you ask yourself,
It depends on your interpretation. Depending on some, they are random.
well, some people say they are random, but that doesn't mean that those people are right. So those people
Right. I'm just saying, but
are,
let's be clear. Let's be clear that the field consensus is that there is, as far as we know, ontic randomness accepted at the quantum level.
oh
When
yes,
radioactive decay
yes,
occurs,
but
it is considered to be acausal. We have no idea why one aspect of radiation occurs and another
right.
one doesn't.
And
Okay.
radiations,
I can
thank you
speak.
for
I can
reminding me
speak
of
to that.
radiation. That's a good example of why I believe randomness exists in the universe, because
Sure.
I think
Okay,
radiation is a
good.
good example of randomness.
Sure.
So now you've given me the recollection that I can logically defend randomness and free will. But I would argue that to say that, do you have a good argument that randomness would disguise itself as free will?
I don't have a good argument for free will other than to say it's a feeling that we have.
Right, but why would randomness disguise itself as free will if it wasn't real free will? If it
I
wasn't
don't think
libertarian free
this,
will?
I think the word disguise is sort of, I think
Why
it's a
would we
bizarre
even have the
term.
sense? Why would we even have the sense that we have free will if we were making decisions randomly? Let me give you an example. If I ask you to choose a number between 1 and 100, do you feel like you choose it?
I feel it, but I
Yes.
don't think that I
And
have libertarian free will.
if I put a randomly generated number in front of your screen between 1 and 100, would you feel like you chose it?
No, because it's outside of my own body system.
Well, you can use that experiment with whatever you want, but we can observe randomness very clearly, and it's very clear to see what randomness acts like. Whereas what we believe we do is very clear to me that we determine it as long as you haven't, like for me, the only argument against free will was determinism, and I was a determinist atheist at the time that I learned about Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And that's why it challenged my very existence, which I think it challenges yours to believe in libertarian free will, to be honest. Because the only people that I found try to defend randomness instead of libertarian free will, once I've disproven determinism, are the ones that feel like it attacks the very core of who they are. And so I would just urge you to spend some meditation time to think about the difference between, and maybe if you want, I'll put my essay defending free will in the chat and you can read it at a time that you're calm and cool and collected. And you sound very calm, cool, and collected. I'm not saying you don't. I just
Sure.
think that it's a heavy argument to take in like a 2 hour time period.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah,
Appreciate
no
it.
problem. Steve.
Two things. First about randomness, I think there's a misconception about that. And if you look at the term random in statistics, it doesn't mean uncaused. It means that we don't see a pattern. Okay, so when we're talking about quantum mechanics, when they say it's random, they don't see a pattern there. It doesn't mean there is one. It doesn't mean there isn't a pattern. It's just we don't see it, so we call it random. But quantum physics actually disproves this notion that uncaused randomness or chance with the Born rule. Now, the Born rule is a fundamental tenet of quantum mechanics. And what it does, for those who aren't familiar with it, it calculates the probability distribution of what will be actualized when they take a measurement. So there's probability distribution, that says, well, here's the probability it'll be actualized here. If you think about the double slit experiment, here's the probability. So if that obtains, which it does, it's been experimentally verified over and over and over and over again. If that obtains, that means that it's not by chance, because it happens. Otherwise, there'd be no pattern at all, but there is this consistent probability distribution. So randomness does not mean chance. It just means we don't get the pattern. Now, if we thought about, say, a cosmic, they talk about a cosmic wave function. If we thought about, and the wave function is related to the Born rule, if we thought about
Well,
that.
we gotta finish up here, Steve. I gotta close out and get my kids to sleep. It's after 9 o'clock.
Okay. Thank you.
So I just want to give a quick plug for double slit experiment. Go to YouTube and go to Freethinker Institute double slit experiment. Scientists still don't understand why the double slit experiment gets the results it does, and I think I can logically defend it using the argument that we talked about tonight and defending libertarian free will. So take a look at that. I do want to thank everybody for comments and questions, and I need to shut down now. Sorry, Ron and Carrie.
Yeah,
But
Garrett, can I just
yeah,
take 30 seconds?
30 seconds. Go ahead.
All I need is 30 seconds. One, to the previous gentleman, David Bohm, he talked about a hidden variables, which would explain the randomness. And you have to read up on that. That's quantum physics, and I'm a layman, and that's beyond my pay grade. The other thing,
I've read it.
Yeah, the other thing is that going forward, Garrett, I don't know if when you talked about consciousness, you dealt with this issue of the hard question of consciousness.
Yeah, I
but
did.
But I think it's worth looking at some more. I don't know what came up. Also, you could include the hard question of matter in that as well.
I actually called the hard question of consciousness not very hard at all. I think it's actually very simple. So I think he only finds it hard because he's a determinist. So like it's not actually hard if you believe in libertarian free will. It's very clear and it's very clear, simple, and everything fits together nicely, which is why I can explain Heisenberg uncertainty principle, the double slit experiment, all these things that scientists get baffled by. They're baffled by it simply because they can't possibly fathom the idea of libertarian free will, and they will throw out the baby with the bathwater to just disagree with libertarian free will. And I just think that's short-sighted. To answer your question about hidden variables explaining the randomness, I'm going to share another essay with you. There's a theorem, and I'm blanking on it right now, but I'll share my argument against determinism. This is not the really strong free will argument against uh, this is not the really strong argument for free will that disproves determinism. It's arguments that almost disprove determinism with accepted science. And I can see what just to give you a second, let me see if shoot. I'm trying to
Well,
remember.
I think you just better put the babies to sleep.
Yeah, I do. I do need to do that. So take a look at the determinism essay, and I basically tried to make a good logical argument that accepted science says that local variables can't explain randomness unless you believe it essentially comes down to unless you believe that things further away than outer space are determining quantum fluctuations rather than things closer than the distance from here to outer space, which is pretty unfathomably likely considering that everything else is inverse square Fields law in physics. Like everything distance matters and the closest things matter the most. So this would have to be the only exception to that. And so superdeterminism is, in my opinion, all but dead. And then my argument defending libertarian free will, which I posted earlier, is the final nail in the coffin.
Yeah, but what about
Don't
the
forget
nail? What
entanglement.
about I was
That
going
was
to
what I
just
was talking
say,
about is
yeah,
entanglement. Yeah.
that's what I was going to say as
Yeah,
well.
that's what I was talking
Yeah,
about is entanglement. So
right.
the theorem that I'm referring to is about quantum entanglement. So
Obviously, if entanglement is true, all of Isaac Newton's things have to be put in a lower dimension, as you were talking about different dimensions, and because the quantum is a totally different dimension. But please, please
no,
put your children to sleep.
yeah,
Let's.
I will do that. But thank you all for participating, for the great comments and questions, and for listening to each other and me intently. And hope everybody has a great night and hope to see you guys next week. I don't remember what we're talking about, but we'll have fun doing it.